The stagecoach arrived in Oakhaven under a sun that felt less like a celestial body and more like a hammered sheet of copper pressing down upon the earth. Dust plumed behind the heavy wooden wheels, a choking alkaline cloud that coated the storefronts and settled onto the wide brims of the men loitering outside the saloon. Inside the coach, Mei Lin sat with her spine rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The dark wool of her traveling dress was entirely unsuited for the brutal summer heat of the territory, but it was the only respectable garment she had left. Her brother Jin had always told her that respectability was the armor of the outsider. Now Jin was buried in an unmarked grave 300 miles back down the trail, taken by a sudden violent fever, and Mei Lin wore her armor alone. She waited until the coach jerked to a final bone-rattling halt before she moved. The driver, a man whose face was mapped with dirt and deep creases, swung the door open and offered a perfunctory, calloused hand. She ignored it, stepping down onto the rough wooden boardwalk with a practiced grace that belied the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Her trunk, a scuffed leather-bound box containing everything she owned in the world, was unceremoniously dropped onto the dust by the driver's boots. He muttered something about the delay her brother's death had caused them, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the street before climbing back up to his seat. Mei Lin did not look back at him. She focused her dark eyes on the building across the thoroughfare. The sign above the door read, in imposing gold lettering, Oakhaven Mercantile and Trust. The interior of the bank was a stark contrast to the blinding street. It was dim, smelling of oiled floorboards, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of uncirculated coins. Behind a heavy oak counter stood Cornelius Vance, the town's mayor and chief financier. Vance was a man who wore his prosperity like a heavy winter coat, sweating beneath a tailored suit that strained against his considerable girth. His smile was a practiced arrangement of facial muscles, entirely devoid of warmth. When Mei Lin approached the counter and slid her brother's bank draft across the polished wood, Vance did not immediately look at the paper. He looked at her, his pale eyes cataloguing her worn dress, the dust on her boots, and the quiet, desperate dignity in her posture. Mei Lin spoke evenly, her voice betraying none of the tremor that vibrated in her chest. She explained the situation, the tragic passing of her brother on the journey from San Francisco, and her need to draw upon the funds they had deposited with Vance's correspondent bank months prior. It was their entire livelihood. The capital meant to start a new mercantile business in this very town. Vance picked up the draft with two thick fingers, turning it over in the dim light. He sighed, a sound of profound theatrical regret. He tapped the signature line. He spoke in a voice that was superficially pleasant, honeyed with false sympathy, explaining that the signature was irregular. He claimed that, without her brother present to verify the draft, the bank's strict regulations prevented him from releasing a single cent. The air in the bank seemed to grow thinner. Mei Lin felt a cold dread pooling in her stomach, a sensation entirely separate from the stifling heat of the room. She calmly pointed out the matching seal, the corresponding ledger numbers, the undeniable proof of the document's authenticity. Vance merely shook his head, his patronizing smile firmly in place. He suggested, with a veiled glint in his eye, that a woman in her unfortunate position might find employment at the saloon, or perhaps as a scullery maid at the boarding house, until the matter could be cleared up by the regional authorities, a process he casually estimated might take 6 months. It was a polite execution. He was stripping her of her resources, leaving her entirely at the mercy of a town that viewed her with open suspicion. Mei Lin did not plead. She recognized the predatory gleam in Vance's eyes, the quiet satisfaction of a man who enjoyed holding the power of ruin over the vulnerable. She took the draft, her fingers trembling only slightly, as she returned it to her reticule and walked out of the bank. The heat of the street hit her like a physical blow. She stood beside her leather trunk, an island of isolation amidst the bustling traffic of wagons and riders. Across the street, a group of women in stiff calico dresses paused outside the general store, their heads leaning together as they cast sidelong, judging glances at the stranger. They saw a woman without a protector, without means, standing in the dust. In a town like Oakhaven, that was a dangerous thing to be. From the shadowed doorway of the blacksmith's forge, Silas Thorne watched the scene unfold. Silas was a man who had carved his existence out of silence and hard labor. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a faded canvas shirt, his skin weathered to the color of old saddle leather. Years ago, he had buried his young wife, Eleanor, beneath a lonely cottonwood tree on his sprawling ranch, the Ironwood. Since that day, he had built high, impenetrable fences around his heart and his property. He came into town only for supplies, speaking in low, measured tones, commanding a deep respect from the townsfolk that was mingled with a healthy dose of fear. He was known as a just man, but a hard one. Silas had seen Mei Lin enter the bank. He knew Cornelius Vance well. Vance had been trying to get his soft, greedy hands on the water rights of the Ironwood for 5 years, using every legal trick and underhanded pressure tactic available. When Silas saw the woman emerge from the bank, her back straight but her eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who had just watched their future evaporate, he understood exactly what had transpired. Vance had denied her. Silas watched the townswomen whispering. He watched the men outside the saloon nudging each other. He saw the complete, devastating isolation of the woman standing by her trunk. Grief moves like weather, Silas often thought. It comes in sudden storms and settles in long grey seasons. He recognized the storm in the stranger's eyes. He did not feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion on the frontier. What he felt was a sudden, sharp recognition of a kindred spirit, someone holding themselves together through sheer, stubborn force of will. He stepped out of the shadows of the forge. His boots made a heavy, rhythmic sound on the wooden boardwalk as he crossed the street. The whispering women fell silent as he passed. The men outside the saloon suddenly found their boots fascinating. Silas ignored them all, stopping a respectful distance from Mei Lin. He looked down at her. Up close he could see the fine layer of dust on her dark hair and the exhaustion bracketing her mouth. She looked back at him, her gaze unflinching, assessing the threat he might pose. Silas took off his weathered hat, holding it loosely in his calloused hands. He did not offer a smile. He offered a plain, declarative statement. He told her his name. He pointed a long finger toward the distant, rolling hills where the Ironwood lay. He stated that he owned a ranch, that he had 50 head of cattle to move, a bunkhouse full of hands who needed feeding, and a study full of ledgers that had not been balanced since the spring thaw. Mei Lin listened, her expression guarded. She noted the lack of condescension in his voice. He was not looking at her the way Vance had, as a problem to be exploited. He was looking at her as a potential solution to a practical problem. Silas continued, his voice a low, steady rumble. He offered her a position. He needed a bookkeeper and someone to bring order to his household. He offered a fair monthly wage, a private room in the main house, and board. He framed it entirely as a mutually beneficial transaction, a business arrangement that would save him the trouble of hiring a man from the city. Mei Lin calculated her options. They were non-existent. Her pride warred with her practical nature, but she possessed a fiercely logical mind. This man, Silas Thorne, offered a lifeline that did not require her to compromise her dignity. She asked him, her voice clear and precise, what his terms were regarding the ledgers, and if she would have full authority over the household accounts. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of genuine respect sparking in their depths. He agreed to her terms without hesitation. He reached down, lifted her heavy leather trunk as effortlessly as if it were filled with feathers, and told her his wagon was parked behind the feed store. The arrangement was struck in the middle of the dusty street, witnessed by the silent, staring town. The ride to the Ironwood Ranch took 2 hours. The landscape shifted from the flat, scrub-brush plains of the town's outskirts to rolling hills dotted with ancient, twisting oaks and jagged outcroppings of red rock. The silence between them in the wagon was profound, but it was not heavy. It was the silence of two people who were accustomed to their own company, who felt no need to fill the empty air with meaningless chatter. Mei Lin watched the land pass, noting the well-maintained fences, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance, the undeniable signs of a prosperous, tightly run operation. Yet when they finally crested a hill and the main house came into view, she saw the neglect. The house was a large, sturdy structure of stone and timber, built to withstand the punishing frontier winters. But the paint on the porch railing was peeling, the windows were clouded with dust, and the flower beds flanking the entrance were choked with dead brown weeds. It was a house that had been built for a family, but was currently occupied only by a ghost and a man who worked too hard to notice the decay. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt, secured the brake, and carried her trunk inside. He showed her to a room on the ground floor. It was sparsely furnished but clean, with a window that looked out over the sprawling western pastures. He told her the kitchen was hers to command, the study was down the hall, and he would expect dinner at 6. Then he tipped his hat and walked out toward the barns. Mei Lin did not rest. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into a sturdy cotton work dress she had made herself, and tied a coarse apron around her waist. She spent the first 3 days systematically stripping the house of its accumulated neglect. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the wide oak planks gleamed. She washed the windows, letting the golden afternoon light pour into the previously gloomy rooms. She took inventory of the pantry, discarding spoiled goods and reorganizing the preserves. Silas watched her transformation of his home with quiet astonishment. He would come in from the fields, smelling of horse sweat and dust, to find the house smelling of baked bread and lemon oil. He said nothing, but he noticed everything. On the 4th day, Maylene entered the study. It was a masculine room, dominated by a massive roll-top desk that was buried under mountains of receipts, invoices, and unopened correspondence. She approached the desk with the focused intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. She spent the entire day sorting the paper, categorizing the debts and the credits. When she finally opened the heavy, leather-bound ledgers, her practiced eyes began to dance across the columns of numbers. Mathematics was a language she understood intimately. It was a realm where logic prevailed and deception was always eventually exposed by a missing sum. By the end of the week, Maylene had uncovered a pattern. It was subtle, hidden in inflated freight charges, mysteriously low yields on cattle sales brokered through the town bank, and exorbitant interest rates applied to minor supply lines. The common denominator in every discrepancy was the Oak Haven Mercantile and Trust. Cornelius Vance was systematically bleeding the Ironwood Ranch. He was skimming percentages, altering tallies, and doing it so carefully that a man like Silas, who hated paperwork and trusted his own hard work to see him through, would never notice until the losses became catastrophic. That evening, after a dinner of roasted fowl and root vegetables, Maylene did not retreat to her room. She waited until Silas had poured himself a cup of black coffee and settled into the armchair by the cold hearth. She brought the primary ledger out from the study and laid it open on the table beside him. She did not accuse. She simply pointed. With a steady hand and a precise voice, she walked him through the numbers. She showed him the inflated freight dockets. She showed him the missing percentages from the spring cattle drive. She demonstrated, with cold, hard arithmetic, that Cornelius Vance had stolen nearly $2,000 from him over the past 3 years. Silas stared at the ledger for a long time. The silence in the room stretched, growing taut and heavy. Maylene watched his face, expecting anger, perhaps a sudden violent outburst. Instead, Silas remained perfectly still. The only sign of his internal fury was the white-knuckled grip his hand had on the handle of his coffee cup. He traced the numbers she had circled with a calloused finger. He realized the magnitude of her skill, the sharpness of her mind. He looked up at her, really looked at her, seeing past the quiet housekeeper to the formidable intellect beneath. He told her, in a voice dangerously soft, that he had always known Vance was a snake, but he had not realized the snake had managed to sink its fangs so deeply into his livelihood. From that night on, the dynamic between them shifted. The arrangement remained formal, but the unspoken respect deepened into a profound partnership. Silas began consulting her on business decisions. He would outline his plans for purchasing adjacent grazing land, and she would calculate the return on investment. They spent their evenings in the study, the warm glow of the oil lamp illuminating the ledgers between them. The silence that filled the house was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the comfortable, shared silence of two people working toward a common goal. Maylene found herself looking forward to the heavy tread of his boots on the porch in the evening. Silas found himself lingering in the kitchen in the morning, watching the morning sun catch the dark sheen of her hair as she kneaded dough. News of their arrangement, however, did not sit well in Oak Haven. A single woman living unchaperoned on the ranch of a wealthy widower was prime fodder for the town's vicious rumor mill. The whispers that had started on the day of her arrival grew into a steady, venomous hum. The townswomen ostracized Maylene when she came into town for supplies, crossing the street to avoid her, their faces masks of moral outrage. Clara Higgins, the widow who ran the boarding house and possessed a sharp tongue and a fair mind, was the only one who would serve her without a sneer. Clara told Maylene, over a hastily poured cup of tea in the back room of the Mercantile, that Cornelius Vance was fanning the flames of the gossip, using the town's prejudice to isolate Silas. Vance's motivations were clear to Maylene. He had realized that Silas's books were suddenly being managed with ruthless efficiency. The skimming had to stop, and Vance was a man who lived far beyond his means. He needed the Ironwoods' capital, and he coveted the ranch's access to the Sweetwater River. One sweltering afternoon, Vance's polished black carriage rolled up the long drive to the Ironwood. Silas was out mending a line fence, so Maylene stood on the porch to receive him. Vance stepped down, wiping his sweating brow with a silk handkerchief, his eyes roaming over the improved state of the house with evident distaste. He greeted her with that same oily, superficial politeness he had used in the bank. He expressed a mock concern for Silas's reputation, suggesting that her presence at the ranch was causing a scandal that could damage Silas's standing in the territory. He hinted heavily that the bank might have to call in a forgotten boundary note, a spurious claim on the riverfront property, if Silas continued to flout the moral standards of the community. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel small and shameful, hoping she would flee and leave Silas vulnerable once again. Mei Lin did not flinch. She stood on the porch, her hands folded in her apron, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. She looked Vance in the eye and told him that Mr. Thorne's reputation was built on his integrity, not on the idle gossip of idle people. She informed him that she had reviewed the boundary notes, and the claim he was referring to had been settled in full 5 years prior, complete with a notarized receipt that she had personally filed in the study. Vance's smile faltered, the mask slipping for just a fraction of a second to reveal the panicked, vicious cornered animal beneath. He tipped his hat stiffly, climbed back into his carriage, and ordered his driver back to town. Mei Lin watched him go, a cold certainty settling in her chest. The threat was no longer veiled. Vance would strike, and he would strike soon. The crisis came 3 nights later, during the dark of the moon, when the wind was blowing hard from the east. It was the dry season, the time of year when the prairie grass was like tinder, waiting for a spark. Mei Lin woke in the dead of night to the acrid, choking smell of wood smoke. She threw off her blankets, rushing to the window. The horizon to the east, where the lower pastures lay, was glowing with an angry, unnatural orange light. It was not a lightning strike. The sky was perfectly clear. It was a deliberately set fire, positioned to use the wind to sweep across the grazing land and drive straight toward the main barns and the house. She did not scream. She pulled on her boots, threw a heavy wool shawl over her nightgown, and ran down the hall. She met Silas coming out of his room, his face grim, his suspenders half pulled over his shoulders. He didn't need to ask. He told her to wake the hands in the bunkhouse, to get every available bucket and wet sack, and to meet him down by the creek line. He was going for the horses. The breeding stallion, a massive, temperamental black beast that was the pride of the ranch, was in the lower paddock, directly in the path of the flames. The next hours were a chaotic blur of heat, smoke, and desperate labor. Mei Lin ran to the bunkhouse, banging on the door, her voice cutting through the night, organizing the sleepy, confused ranch hands with military precision. She directed a line of men to the creek, forming a bucket brigade to soak the ground around the main barns. The roar of the fire was deafening, a monstrous, consuming sound that swallowed the shouts of the men. The heat rolled over them in physical waves, singeing her hair and blistering her skin. Through the smoke, she saw Silas in the lower paddock. The fire had reached the fence line. The stallion was in a frenzy, rearing and kicking at the wooden rails, its eyes rolling white with terror. Silas was trying to get a halter on the beast, but the horse was too panicked, striking out with deadly hooves. Silas dodged a blow that would have crushed his skull, stumbling backward into the ash. The fire leaped the fence, catching the dry straw in the corner of the paddock. Mei Lin did not think. She acted. She grabbed a heavy woolen horse blanket from the fence, plunged it into a nearby water trough until it was soaked through, and ran into the paddock. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. She threw the heavy, wet blanket over the stallion's head, blinding it, cutting off the sight of the flames. The horse froze for a crucial second. She grabbed the halter, her hands burning against the hot leather, and threw her entire weight backward, dragging the beast toward the open gate. Silas recovered, rushing to her side, his large hands covering hers on the lead rope. Together they forced the trembling, blinded animal out of the paddock and up the hill toward safety, just as the wooden shelter collapsed in a shower of sparks. They fought the fire until dawn. They beat the flames with wet sacks, dug trenches in the hard earth, and choked on the thick, gray smoke. When the wind finally died and the fire burned itself out against the rocky ridge, leaving a vast, blackened scar across the landscape, they collapsed by the main water trough. The ranch hands, exhausted and soot-stained, retreated to the bunkhouse. Silas and Mei Lin were left alone in the gray, filtering light of morning. They sat side by side on the edge of the trough. They were covered in ash, their clothes singed, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Mei Lin's hands were blistered, her knuckles raw. Silas reached over, taking her hands in his. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to his rough appearance. He dipped his kerchief into the cool water and began to carefully clean the soot and dried blood from her skin. The physical contact, the first they had shared beyond the passing of a ledger or a plate, sent a jolt through Maylene that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of the night. Silas looked at her blistered hands, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He told her she could have been killed. He told her he had spent 5 years building walls to make sure he never had to feel the terror of losing someone again, and watching her run into that burning paddock had torn those walls down in a single instant. He spoke of Eleanor, of the fever that had taken her so quickly, of the helpless crushing grief that had turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. He confessed his fear, the deep-seated terror that anyone he cared for was destined to be taken from him. Maylene listened, the cool water soothing her burns, his rough hands anchoring her. She looked at the blackened fields, then back at his face. She told him about Jin. She spoke of the long, brutal journey, the desperation of watching her brother fade, the cold reality of digging a grave in the unforgiving earth. She told him that grief was not a wall to hide behind, but a weight you learned to carry. She looked into his eyes and told him that she was not a ghost, and she was not easily broken. They sat there as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and gold, bound together by the shared crucible of survival and the vulnerable confession of their deepest wounds. The fire was the final provocation. Silas and Maylene did not spend the day resting. They washed, they dressed in their finest town clothes, and they packed the heavy leather ledgers into Silas's saddlebags. They rode into Oakhaven side by side, a unified front, their expressions set in stone. The town was unusually quiet, the lingering smell of smoke having drifted over the plains, a silent testament to the violence of the night. They did not go to the sheriff first. They went straight to the Oakhaven Mercantile and Trust. Cornelius Vance was standing behind his counter, looking remarkably fresh and composed. When Silas and Maylene entered, his face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered his oily smile. He opened his mouth to offer false condolences about the fire, but Silas cut him off. Silas did not shout. He spoke in a voice that carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a falling tree. He told Vance that the game was over. He demanded that Vance step out from behind the counter and face him. The commotion drew the attention of the street. People began to gather in the doorway of the bank, peering in, drawn by the palpable tension. Clara Higgins stood near the front, her arms crossed, watching intently. Silas stepped back, allowing Maylene to step forward. She placed the heavy ledgers onto the polished oak counter. She opened them, her hands steady, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the silent room. Maylene did not make emotional accusations. She destroyed Cornelius Vance with mathematics. She read out the dates, the doctored freight charges, the missing percentages from the cattle sales. She presented the original invoices, which she had meticulously cross-referenced against the bank's own posted rates. She laid out the fraudulent boundary claim, producing the notarized receipt of settlement. She explained the mechanism of the theft so clearly, so precisely, that even the most uneducated ranch hand in the doorway could understand the depth of the betrayal. She proved that Vance had not only stolen from Silas, but had been skimming from half the ranchers in the territory. Vance tried to bluster. He sputtered about irregularities, about misunderstandings, about the unreliability of a foreign woman's accounting. But the numbers were absolute. The proof was written in his own clerk's handwriting. The crowd in the doorway began to murmur, the sound growing into an angry, restless rumble. Men who had owed Vance money, men who had lost land to his irregularities, pushed their way into the bank. The town's sheriff, a slow-moving but honest man named Miller, stepped through the crowd, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. He looked at the ledgers, looked at Vance's sweating, terrified face, and told the mayor that they needed to take a walk over to the jailhouse to discuss these discrepancies in private. Vance's power evaporated in an instant. He was stripped of his respectability, exposed as a thief and a coward in front of the town he had ruled through intimidation and debt. As the sheriff led him away, a defeated, broken man, the crowd parted for them in dead silence. Then, the townsfolk turned their eyes to Silas and Maylene. The judgment, the suspicion, the whispered prejudices were gone. In their place was a stunned, grudging respect. Maylene had not just saved the ironwood, she had freed the town from a predator. Silas and Maylene walked out of the bank and onto the sun-drenched boardwalk. The heat was still oppressive, but the air felt remarkably clean. They stood by the horses, the heavy saddlebags now empty of their burden. Silas looked down at her. The stern, guarded lines of his face had softened. He took his hat off, holding it in his hands just as he had on the day they met. He did not offer flowery words of passion. He was a practical man, and he knew she was a practical woman. He looked at her blistered hands, then up into her dark, resilient eyes. He told her that she had saved his ranch, exposed a thief, and brought his house back to life. But more than that, he told her, she had reminded him how to live. He stated in his low, steady rumble that the Ironwood needed a partner, not just a bookkeeper. He told her that he needed a partner. He asked her to stay, not as an employee, not as a housekeeper, but as his wife, to share the land, the labor, and the life they had fought for together. Malin looked at the man before her. She saw his integrity, his quiet strength, and the deep, abiding respect he held for her. She saw a future that was not built on charity or desperation, but on an equal, earned partnership. She let a small, genuine smile touch her lips. She reached out, her bandaged hand resting against his rough cheek. She told him that she accepted his terms. A year later, the Ironwood Ranch was unrecognizable from the neglected estate Malin had first encountered. The scars of the fire on the lower pasture had healed, covered in a thick, vibrant carpet of new green grass. A massive new barn, built with the recovered funds from Vance's seized assets, stood proudly near the creek. The house was painted, the windows shone, and a sprawling garden of vegetables and bright, resilient frontier flowers bloomed fiercely in the front yard. Cornelius Vance was serving a long sentence in the territorial prison, and the town of Oakhaven had learned to treat the Thorns with the utmost deference and respect. It was evening, the golden hour when the harsh light of the day softened and the shadows grew long and cool. Silas and Malin sat side by side on the wide wooden porch. Silas was oiling a piece of harness leather, the rhythmic, repetitive motion a comfort to his hands. Malin sat with a mending basket, her needle flashing silver in the fading light. The ledgers inside were perfectly balanced. The cattle were secured. The ranch was thriving. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was a living thing, rich and deep, built on shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, profound love that required no constant vocalization. Silas finished with the leather, setting it aside. He reached over, taking Malin's hand, his thumb tracing the faint, faded scar of a burn across her knuckles. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun dip below the jagged red hills, painting the sky in strokes of fire and peace. They sat together as the stars began to prick the deepening blue, two solitary souls who had stood their ground, spoken the truth, and built a fortress of a life out of the dust.